Okay, welcome everybody to another edition of Drunk Agile. Unfortunately, I think tonight is going to be Dry Agile,
Yep.
because we are sans whiskey. This is yeah. Prateek has a water. I have a water. It's just not a good day in the neighborhood tonight. So we do not accept any responsibility for how good or probably how bad this next episode is going to be because we can't be drunk while we're doing it. So anyway, as always, I am your host, Daniel Vacanti. With me is my friend and colleague,
Prateek Singh.
and behind him, the star of every Drunk Agile show, is Nisha.
She's as active as she always is.
Right. So when last we left off, again, assuming that we're doing these in orders, when last we left off, we're kind of getting back to the basics of how do you start with flow, and how do you really practice flow. So in a couple of episodes ago, we talked about where do you start, some of the things to consider when you're starting in terms of visualizing and defining your workflow. Then I think in the last show we talked a lot about actively managing items in progress. A lot of people think that in Kanban, all you do is you limit work in progress, and okay, you're good enough, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So we spent a lot of time talking about the active management of items in progress. Well, tonight is the third in the trilogy, if you will, the final leg of the three-legged stool, which is improving workflow. So once you've established a workflow and once you're operating it, it doesn't stop there because we constantly want to be improving. We constantly want to get better. So with that, Prateek, I don't know. Do you want to start us off with some thoughts in terms of what is improving a workflow? Where and how do we do that? Why do we care?
Yeah, to begin with, everything that we've talked about so far, right? It's been centered around, again, defining that workflow and operating it. So because you have a definition of workflow and you're operating it, if there are problems in that workflow, they are in one of those two areas. It's either as we started working through things, we figured out that we defined something incorrectly, or we figured out there's something wrong with our policies with which we are operating this workflow. So those would be the places I would start looking at to go, okay, if we have to improve this, let's start here.
So yeah, let's take first things first, because this is something we mention a lot in our trainings. If you did go through a training, or if you just designed a board on your own, it's one of the things that we point out a lot is that first initial shot of your board, of your visualization, is great, but you have to recognize that it's probably wrong, right? And it's not wrong because, like we say, it's not wrong because you suck. It's just wrong because your information, when you're designing the board, your information is imperfect, and you are going to gain information as you operate it. So if you've designed a board, if you're doing Kanban and you designed a board, say 6 months ago or 12 months ago, and your board right now looks exactly like it did 6 months ago or 12 months ago, you're doing it wrong, right? I don't know how to say it anything else than that. So so Prateek, tell us what might be some clues when you're looking at your board that maybe this visualization should change. Maybe this is not really working out the way that we think it should.
Yeah, that's the first thing was defining workflow, looking at this thing, and if you constantly see cards stacking up in one area, if you constantly see the same type of work getting blocked, if you constantly see I don't know if you're using, say, avatars to represent people and constantly see that this one person is holding up everything else because they are the one everyone else needs and has the siloed information. Your board is going to scream at you those things. It's we have 10 cards active, 7 of them are sitting here. So as you see those things, it's imperative that we go in and start making some changes, some tweaks to the policies.
And you have to be really, really careful, because this is, like a lot of the teams we work with use Jira. And to your point, whenever Jira, especially if you've set work in progress limits fairly aggressively, whenever you violate work in progress limits in Jira, it'll turn the whole column red. Well, well, that's great because that's a great visual indicator that, hey, something's wrong here. We need to do something about it. The problem with that is if every time you walk up to the board, that column is red, you quickly become blind to the fact that you've got a blind column. But the board is screaming at you that there is some improvement opportunity here that needs to be done.
This is a little anecdote. You just reminded me of this. I remember the coffee station at work where we used to make coffee pretty much daily was just behind this particular team. And I remember while I was making coffee, seeing one of the team members pick a card from a column that was not red and move it into progress into a column that was red. The team was so used to the column being red that they had literally gone colorblind to it. Like, if it's always red, that doesn't necessarily mean anything.
And so this is actually, I mean, we'll probably do a whole other talk just on this, but this is a concept that we come to refer to as inept and inapt. So when you think about improving a workflow, most people will kind of default to kind of the Scrum way of thinking about things. And Scrum talks a lot about inspect and adapt, which is great, right? I don't mean to make that sound like it's bad. That is actually absolutely what you should be doing, inspect and adapt. The problem is most people, when they inspect, they see the wrong things, and when they adapt, they change the wrong things. And so we call that, inept and inapt. And your anecdote is a perfect example of that. The board was screaming at the team that there's something wrong, and it's kind of telling them exactly what should change, but they completely ignored it, and kind of went on business as usual.
Yeah. I mean, there's the other side of it, the other inept and inapt side of it, which is, oh, it's red. Well, we can just raise it probably is telling us we need to raise the WIP limit. That will make it not red. Yeah. That's another inept and inapt behavior.
Yeah. So I mean, there's when we talk about improving your workflow, there's the adjusting work in progress limits. Mm-hmm. There's the changing the policies, the exit criteria for the columns. There's the potentially eliminating columns, mm-hmm. hopefully not adding them. I mean, certainly you should add them if you think it's warranted, but removing columns, changing the names of columns. Like I said, if your board looks like it did 6 months ago, it's probably not. You're probably not doing it right. Can you talk to us a little bit about why it's dangerous to add a column on your board as an improvement? Why is that dangerous? And why do teams always want to run to that one? Like, let's put in we don't get to see where code review is happening in our workflow, so we want a code review column. Why is that potentially dangerous?
I think this stems from the misinformation that's out there that Kanban is all about visualizing everything. And it is to a good extent about visualizing, but it's about visualizing so that you can understand and improve. It's not to say that every little step that you take needs to be visualized. You won't visualize, I am typing code right now, then I am checking in code right now. You won't necessarily do those things. But that's besides the point. That's kind of why I think teams go towards it. They go towards it because Kanban says visualize, so let's visualize everything. But the adverse effect of adding more columns than necessary, and I don't know what the right number of necessary columns is that it's an excuse to inflate WIP. Every column that you add, you'll probably, not necessarily, but probably put a WIP limit on it, and as an effect, what you'll end up doing is the total WIP across the board is probably going to keep growing. It ends up acting as an excuse to inflate WIP.
Right, and so that's why we try to encourage teams to reduce the number of columns. I mean, and there's absolutely, by the way, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a to-do, doing, and done board. I'm not mm-hmm. saying that that's the perfect end state, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But the kind of the antidote to what you're talking about is, I think what a lot of people fail to realize is one of the biggest reasons why you may have modeled multiple columns on a board is usually a column is put in, a column represents some type of handoff. from one specialization to another. And ideally what we're doing is, as much as possible, eliminating those handoffs. We want to eliminate those handoffs either through, better generalization or automation or other improvements, whatever they are. We want to eliminate those handoffs as much as possible, not add in more as more columns on our board. That's the exact opposite of really, I think, what we're doing. Right?
Yeah, and another adverse effect is many a time these are columns where people just push work to just so they can pick up new work. So it becomes a point of, like, as you mentioned, code review. Like, yeah, someone has to review my code. I'm not going to sit around and wait for it. I want to pick up the next thing now.
Yeah. Or the fan favorite blocked column. Let's have a blocked column. And maybe we need another blocked column. Okay, right. So that's visualization. What about metrics? I mean, is visualization the only place where we can see?
Yeah. So I think the things we talked about: WIP limits, visualization policies. That's inspecting the definition of the workflow piece. Now let's inspect the active management piece. How well are we doing with that? And that's where our favorite charts like scatter plots come into play, right? Let's take a look at how long things were taking. Were these as long as we expected them to take, or were they taking much longer? Does that point towards, are we not managing our work appropriately? Do we need to change some policies around how we manage our work on a day-to-day basis?
Yep. And you I hate to say it, but you bring up a good point. And I don't know if this is another inept and inapt topic or another topic all on its own, but specifically the scatter plot. When we talk about looking at metrics for improvement, there's a reason why we advocate for the scatter plot. I know a lot of people have been told like a cycle time histogram is the way to go. But there's a reason. There are lots of reasons why we advocate for a scatter plot. To me, chief of which is, and this is going all the way back to Walter Sheward, is whenever you have time series data, and cycle time is time series data. Whenever you have time series data, generally speaking, a histogram is a very, very poor way to visualize the data. And the reason that's important is because when you have time series data, the time at which you collected that data is very contextually relevant, is very contextually important. And you lose all that time context. The second you move to a histogram, you lose all of that time context. And when we talk about improvement, we need to know, hey, between these 2 weeks or in this month, look at all this funky stuff that went wrong, and we need to talk about that, right? That's to me that's why a scatter plot, when you're looking at improvement, a scatter plot is so much better than a histogram.
Yeah, you're robbing your data of context.
Yeah.
When you're looking at that, man, it's like the immediate thing that came to my mind as you were talking through that was, if we plotted, for example, the Earth's temperature, or if we plotted that on a histogram as opposed to a time series scatter plot or a line chart for that matter, it'll be completely out of context. You completely lose the fact that nothing would look wrong. It would look like it's all the same bars across the board.
Yeah, I wish I could remember the exact quote that Sheward gives a wonderful quote in his book about why not to use a histogram. Maybe in post I'll try and look it up, and I can flash it up as a subtitle on this. I'm too lazy. I'm not going to do that, but
you're not going to do that. That's okay.
Yeah, it's nice to say that.
There's the greater chance of Nisha doing that.
She's doing it right now. Yeah. Okay, so that's the scatter plot. I mean, what else can we look at? What's maybe some other metrics charts that we can look at?
If you were to look at it the same way, you could look at a throughput chart, just a throughput run chart, to see what has there been a great change in overall. Where is it coming from? Because it could be that your cycle time held steady, but there were major changes on the team that you lost people, you gained people, whatever that changed in effect how fast how many things you were getting done.
Yep.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I think it's the same thing with the WIP run chart. You could look at how your WIP has changed over time. Again, it might not be evident from a cycle time scatter plot, it mostly will be, but it might not be, just because the composition of the team could have changed.
Yep. I'm sure a lot of you out there, a lot of you flow people out there, if you're listening, all three of you that are listening to this watching this video right now, we're probably maybe expecting us to say something about a cumulative flow diagram. And don't get me wrong, the cumulative flow diagram is, I think, simultaneously my favorite chart and my least favorite chart. It's kind of the Schrodinger's cat of, of charts. It's my favorite chart because of all the information that is just absolutely packed into it. That you can see the interplay of all of the three flow metrics simultaneously, immediately. It's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. But because of that, there's very little tooling out there that, number one, will calculate a cumulative flow diagram properly. But then number two, because it is so dense with information, people simply don't know how to read it. They get confused when they're looking at it. And they kind of get overwhelmed. And so that's why hopefully I can speak for you. You and I always recommend looking at some of these other charts first. A scatter plot, a throughput run chart, a whip run chart. Things like that are a little bit more focused, a little bit more obvious what's going on. And only when you get really, 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 really good at this stuff can you look at the cumulative flow diagram. And the paradox is, when you get really, really, really good at this stuff, you may not even need the cumulative flow diagram. So something to think about.
I want to just take this back a little bit to something we had mentioned earlier, the inspect and adapt piece. You'd mentioned that, and I think we've found out over time that many folks apply that to their product, but don't apply that to their process. And if you ask us, we thoroughly believe that it's as important to inspect and adapt your process as it is to the product you're creating through that process. I think at some point, I'm sure this was intended, but at some point it feels like it got lost, that folks started applying inspect and adapt only to the product they're creating, as opposed to how they're running the process as well.
Yeah, I don't think that point can be underestimated or overestimated. I don't think it can be either. I don't think it'd be overemphasized. Maybe that's what I'm looking for. I don't think that point can be overemphasized. Because when I first got involved with the Scrum community, when we were developing PSK, I was constantly talking. Scrum people and I were constantly talking past each other, because they were seeing inspect and adapt from the product perspective. I was seeing inspect and adapt from the process perspective. Both are important. I don't want to say one's necessarily more important than the other, but I know where I would start. But that's just my bias. So it's crucially important to know inspect and adapt. You're absolutely right. Inspect and adapt is not just for the product. It's so much more for the process.
Yeah, and then every adaptation, every evolution of your process is an experiment. So just because something worked once doesn't mean it will continue to work. And as even as we've talked about in the past about small working in small batches and all that stuff, it's the same thing. Once you have done this big adjustment to define your workflow, after that, as you play with things, you're literally doing that. That's what you're doing. You're playing with things to find out where are we headed next.
And that's another critical point, because I think a lot of people, especially because we were just talking about Scrum, a lot of people think in Scrum that you have to wait till the end of the sprint to have the retrospective, and or worse, that you can only do a retrospective once and it has to be at the end of the sprint. That's not technically what the Scrum Guide says, or at least it's not how I interpret the Scrum Guide. The way that I would say is, Scrum says you have to do it at least once. You have to make sure during the sprint that you've done it at least once. There's nothing to stop you from doing it more than once. And we talk about this all the time, this idea of moving to more continuous based practices. So we've talked about continuous forecasting. We've talked about continuous delivery. And now we're talking about continuous improvement. I mean, don't necessarily wait till the end of, if you're doing Scrum, don't necessarily wait to the end of the sprint to make an improvement if your board is screaming at you that an improvement is warranted.
yeah, your stand-ups essentially could be mini retrospectives. Yeah.
Yep. A friend of ours, Frank Vega. It's a technique that I learned from him. I mean, I guess this is back when teams were co-located again. So, for a historical perspective, we are doing this in the COVID world. Hopefully, maybe this COVID world is finished by the time you're watching this video. But when teams were co-located and using physical board, Frank Vega's one of his favorite techniques was to have a sheet of paper right next to the board, and he would have kind of an informal whip limit on that. But whenever a team member spotted an improvement opportunity, they would go write it up on that sheet. And whenever they would get to 2 or 3 things, it would stop. The team would stop and be like, okay, let's talk about these improvements, and let's make sure we don't get too far without handling these improvements. And it didn't matter where you were in the sprint. It didn't matter where you were in the release. It didn't matter. It's like once you got to that limit of things that we need to improve, you improved them. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful approach.
Something similar that we have experimented with is the just-in-time retrospective. As soon as a work item closes that took a lot longer than we had expected it to take, let's bring together the folks who worked on it. What did we learn from this, and then disseminate that information to the rest of the team.
Yep. So I don't know. Sorry. So we covered. Updating the definition of the visualization and definition of workflow. We've talked about improving how we operate the workflow. What else? What else is there to say about just general improvements that we haven't covered yet? That's not inept and inapt stuff for maybe the next.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what we should do is next time do a deeper dive into inept.
Yeah. I'm finding it hard to pick up anything right now, just probably because we're not having whiskey.
I know your brain doesn't work as well if you don't have a drink.
It just doesn't.
I don't know what that's about.
We tried. So here, this is the perfect example. We tried the experiment.
Yeah,
and
I was going
we
to say
realized that again, I guess this works now. Many of your experiments won't work.
I don't know about the rest of you, but I find us much more interesting when we're drinking. This, right?
It's pretty much the only way I find us interesting.
Because look, Nish is back there's like, shut up already, really.
Like, are we done yet? Yeah, it's my brain isn't functioning the way it usually does without the whiskey. But so yeah, to me, those are the 2 major areas. This third part of the definition of Kanban, essentially for me, is how do you positively affect the other 2 parts? How do you improve the other 2 parts? How do you improve the definition of workflow, and how do you do the active management of work?
Yep. Well, I mean, yeah. So we can leave it at that, because I mean, I think this hopefully will set us up nicely into more inept and inapt conversations for next week. So I was trying to think. I don't know. Is there a teaser that we can throw out for inept and inapt? Is there in our presentation that we did that we put together 5 minutes before we actually were supposed to go on?
You mean the 2-hour workshop we put together?
in 5 minutes.
Well, we talked about, I think we talked about football and we talked about basketball.
And we already talked about Will Chamberlain, didn't we? Because Will Chamberlain, I think, is kind of the classic inept and inept.
Yeah.
So maybe that's it. If you go find the Wilt Chamberlain example, because we'll probably revisit that in terms of things to watch out for. You think you may be improving, but you may not be. You and probably aren't. How do we separate that signal from the noise? How do we know that we're really improving? How do we not trust ourselves to behave empirically? Right? We say we're empirical. Are we?
We're predictably irrational.
Yeah. So with that, next time I promise, we will join you at a regularly scheduled time, whiskey in hand, much less sober, hopefully much more drunk. I don't know. Do you have anything? Yeah. Do you have anything to say to wrap us up before we?
Nope. That is it. I think again, this is an example of an experiment. The experiment, I believe, is failing.
Yep.
We need whiskey.
We definitely need whiskey. Okay. So we may bin this one and try it again with a couple of drinks. So until then, my name is Daniel Vacanti. Again, with me, Prateek Singh, and we will see you much drunker in the next episode. Have a good night, everybody.